The wind had teeth that night, sharp, cold things that bit through pine and porch alike, whistling like old ghosts through the slats of the half-mended cabin. Snow fell heavy, sideways, thick as wool, blanketing the world in silence and sorrow. It was the kind of night the plains folk feared most, not because of wolves or raiders, but because of the stillness it brought, and what memories might surface in that hush. Ellen Dane swung the axe with rhythm, her breath pluming like a ghost before her. Her skirts were tucked high and pinned, boots buried ankle-deep in white. Each thud of the axe echoed against the timbers, each split of frozen wood another answer to the ache in her shoulders. She did not glance back at the cabin, though she knew her children were watching her from the frosted window, their small faces round and pressed against the glass like pale moons. Inside, warmth flickered low. A fire, built carefully from rationed kindling and twigs, did its best to stave off the winter creeping through every crack. Beside it sat her boy and girl, twin souls born in a summer storm 8 years before. Their names were Ruth and Josiah, but she rarely used them aloud. Names felt like promises, and Ellen had learned to keep promises quiet. "Ma looks cold," Josiah whispered, voice hoarse from a day of silence. He did not often speak first. Ruth reached for his hand and held it without speaking. They waited, watching as their mother worked in the blizzard. When she finally came inside, the storm followed her, white and wild on her shoulders, her lashes iced, her scarf stiff with frost. She shut the door with her hip, dropped the wood with a sigh, and turned toward the fire. She gave the children a nod. No words. Just a nod. She wasn't cruel. But kindness had become something she carried in quiet gestures, a hand on a head, a blanket pulled snug. Her voice was low and worn, like a riverbed smoothed by time and flood alike. They ate in silence, save the crackle of pine wood. Cornbread and turnips boiled in salt water. Nothing more. Josiah tried not to grimace. Ruth chewed with care, as if gratitude might flavor the blandness. Ellen watched them eat, knees drawn up beneath her woolen skirts, and her gaze softened, if only slightly. She had once imagined this moment, firelight on their cheeks, the cabin full of warmth and stories. But the man she'd built that dream with had never been the kind to bring stories to life. He died last spring on a failed trading run, some 15 miles east near Copper Ridge. Fell under his own wagon while drunk, they said. She'd received the news with dry eyes and a strange sort of calm, as if part of her had known he'd leave without a proper goodbye. He'd left her before, in other ways. After supper, Ellen tucked the children into their shared bed, laid thick quilts over their small forms, and pressed a kiss to Ruth's forehead. She paused at Josiah's side, her hand brushing his curls, so much like his father's, only softer. He looked up at her, blinking slow. "Are we gonna be all right if the snow don't stop?" She studied him. A boy pretending not to be afraid. "Snow always stops," she said. Then came the sound, thin, distant, like something between a groan and a cry. The wind moaned, but this was not the wind. Ellen stood still. Years of living alone on the edge of nowhere had taught her the language of storms, of creatures, of danger. This sound was not born of nature. It was human. "Stay here," she said, already reaching for her shawl, the hunting knife from the shelf. Her hands were steady. Her heart, quieter than it should have been. She stepped into the night. The snow blinded. Lantern light barely carved the darkness, a trembling gold that made shadows crawl. She moved past the barn, toward the edge of the corral, where the sound had come from. There he was, half buried in snow, like a forgotten scarecrow dropped by the wind. Blood stained the white around him, spreading slowly like rust in water. His face was turned to the side, and in the flickering light, she saw copper-toned skin, high cheekbones, dark hair tangled with frost. Comanche. Her breath caught, not from fear, not entirely. He wasn't moving. One arm was bent beneath him, the other stretched out as if he'd crawled the last yards on will alone. His chest rose in shallow jerks. A raider. And yet, she crouched beside him, fingers to his neck. Faint pulse. Hot skin, despite the cold. Fever. Wound to the side, old, likely infected. Bruising down his ribs. She didn't know what story he carried, but it had ended here, in her snow, at her feet. She should leave him. Let nature finish the work that whatever violence began. She owed nothing. Her husband's grave sat not 50 feet from here, cold, bitter reminder of how trust could curdle. He had bled into her land. Died, nearly, on her doorstep. She could not explain it, but she saw something not just broken in him, but enduring. Like the mountains after a fire. Ruth's voice carried on the wind. Ma. Ellen looked toward the cabin. Her children, waiting. She sheathed her knife. I ain't doing this for you, she whispered to the man in the snow. I'm doing it for them. Dragging him was like pulling stone through the storm. She looped her arms under his, grunting with effort, boots sliding on ice, each breath a burn. The snow swallowed them as they moved, two shadows stitched by need and chance. Inside, the heat welcomed them like an old friend unsure if it should stay. The children gasped when she heaved the stranger onto the floor near the fire. Get me the clean rags, she said. The whiskey, too. Ruth obeyed without question. Josiah hovered behind, wide-eyed. Is he bad? He whispered. He's hurt, she answered. That's all we know for now. She cut away the crusted shirt, revealing skin marred by old scars and new wounds. He was lean, built like a hawk, nothing wasted, everything honed. She pressed cloth to the torn flesh near his ribs. He winced but did not wake. The twins watched, silent. She cleaned the wound, poured whiskey across it. His breath hitched. One eye opened, just barely, a flicker of amber, sharp and clouded with pain. He met her gaze for a moment, confusion dancing there like smoke. Then he passed out again. Ellen sat back, wiping her hands on her skirt. The storm outside raged still. The fire hissed as snow melted off his skin. She looked at her children, at the man, at the snow on his lashes. This changed everything. But she did not know how. Not yet. Only that the wind no longer sounded quite so empty. By dawn, the storm had softened into silence. No more wind clawing the shutters, no more groans from the woods beyond. Just snow, thick, blinding, untouched, layered over the earth like a burial shroud. The cabin sat half buried in it, chimney whispering smoke into a pale sky, a world muted in white. Inside, the fire cracked low and steady, a heartbeat for the house. Ellen sat beside it, sleeves rolled, face drawn, hands stained with dried blood and the ache of decision. The Comanche man lay on the floor where she'd left him, wrapped in quilts, a sheen of sweat coating his brow. His wound had stopped bleeding, but the fever remained. He murmured in a language she didn't know, restless, body turning slightly as if fleeing something even in sleep. The children watched from their corner, wrapped in their own blanket like fledglings in a nest. Josiah chewed at a thread on the hem. Ruth stared at the man, eyes steady, as if trying to decide what he was. He hadn't moved since midnight. His breathing had slowed some, no longer so ragged, but Ellen knew infection was a shadow with many forms. She'd seen men die days after wounds looked clean. She'd seen the way fever could curl a body like fire curling paper. She rose slowly, knees stiff from hours on the floor, and dipped a rag into the basin. She pressed it gently to his forehead. His skin was burning under the cool cloth, yet a tremble ran through his limbs like he was made of snow. When he stirred, it wasn't from pain, it was from thirst. His lips parted slightly, cracked and dry. She reached for the tin cup by the fire, brought it to his mouth. He sipped without opening his eyes, but swallowed with effort. His throat worked, and then, barely above a whisper, he said something. She didn't catch it. His voice was gravel. He opened one eye. Just one. Golden brown, glazed, still half lost to fever. But aware. He saw her. Not just her shape or face. Her. She could tell. There was something unspoken in the way his gaze did not flinch or falter, as if he'd expected someone else and was surprised to be spared. She nodded once, as if to say yes, you're safe here, though no words passed between them. He closed his eyes again. Sleep claimed him like a tide. Later, she stepped out to check the livestock. The barn had held. The snow piled high against the doors, but the roof had not caved. The cow, Daisy, bleated once. The chickens clucked with offense at the cold. Ellen cleared what she could, fed them with slow, practiced hands, then returned to the house with a bundle of wood and shoulders lined with frost. The stranger was awake when she came back. Not fully, but enough. He tried to sit up. Failed. Grunted low and sharp, falling back with a hiss of pain. Josiah startled at the sound, then scooted behind his sister. Ruth did not move. Ellen crossed the room and knelt. "Don't," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You'll tear it worse." His eyes found hers again. This time, clearer. He lifted a hand, slow, pointing at himself. Then tapped his chest lightly and said, "Tahu." It was a name. Or something like it. She hesitated, then repeated it back, slower. "Tahu." He blinked. Almost a nod. He tried to speak again, but winced and fell silent. Ellen said nothing more. She didn't know his tongue, and he barely seemed to grasp hers. But names were a beginning, and silence had its own kind of language. The children remained wary. Josiah especially. He stayed close to her side, offering to chop kindling just to be outside. Ellen let him, watching from the window, heart twisting with old guilt. He was too young to carry suspicion, but the world had pressed it into him early. Losing a father, watching a mother carry everything, learning the language of hunger, that kind of life sharpened the edges of a child's heart. That night, Ruth brought her little wooden rabbit over to the man. Sat it beside his bed without a word. He looked at it for a long time, then at her. Nodded. When Ruth returned to her blanket, she said, "He's not bad." Ellen didn't answer. She didn't want to lie. Not to herself, not to the children. She didn't know what he was. She only knew he hadn't raised a hand. He hadn't threatened. He had bled quietly in her snow and accepted her care like it surprised him. He stayed on the floor by the fire for 4 days. Fever broke on the third, sweat soaking the quilts, his breath turning calm and even. Ellen changed the bandage twice a day, cleaned the wound, gave him broth, lifted his head when he was strong enough to drink. He never asked why. He only watched, listened. Said her name one evening when the light was low, his voice rough but deliberate. "Ellen." She looked up. The children were already asleep. Snow whispered against the window pane. "Yes," she said. He looked away then, as if the word itself had cost him something. His hands were calloused, the scars along his arms shaped like history carved in flesh. He had been through wars, maybe not all the kind with bullets. He sat up the next morning on his own. Shaky, slow, but upright. The firelight cast golden rings across his face. His hair was loose now, dried, pushed back behind his ears. He looked younger than she'd first thought. Not boyish, but not old. Perhaps 30. Perhaps 30 lives lived already. He gestured to the door, made the sign of walking. She understood. She shook her head. "You need another day." He tilted his head, then nodded. Accepted it. That was the strange thing, how easily he accepted her guidance. Not out of weakness, but as if he trusted her judgment more than his own stubbornness. That afternoon, while he dozed, Ellen sat beside the hearth, knitting another patch into Josiah's coat. She glanced at the man's form, his chest rising slowly, his fingers twitching now and then in sleep, and wondered what kind of world he came from. What he had seen. What had driven him this far north, into snow country, into her life. She realized then that he had not once reached for a weapon, hadn't asked for one, hadn't glanced toward her knife or the old rifle above the door. That silence carried weight. A knock startled her. 3 sharp raps at the door. She stood, heart lurching, and opened it just enough to see. It was Ellis, neighbor down the way. A widower, rough-chinned and always smelling of pipe smoke. He'd offered to marry her once after her husband's death, but she'd known it was pity disguised as protection. "Storm finally passed," he said. "Figured I'd check in." Heard from the mail rider that someone saw tracks near your barn. She held the door firm. Could have been wolves. Ellis squinted past her. Someone in there? She didn't flinch. My brother's boy. Passing through. Sick. He studied her. You ought to be careful, Ellen. There's Comanche raiders been sighted south of here. If you're hiding something. I'm not, she said, calm as a still pond. He looked at her like a man measuring the strength of a fence post before leaning on it. Then nodded, false friendly. Well, let me know if you need help. She shut the door before he finished the sentence. The man by the fire, Tahu, had not stirred. Or maybe he had and pretended not to. Either way, she said nothing. That night, while the children slept, Tahu stood for the first time. She helped him to the chair near the fire. He nodded once in thanks. They sat like that a long while, two silhouettes held by flickering flame, saying nothing. Just the sound of the wind beginning again, gentler this time. Less teeth, more hush. Finally she asked, "Will more come?" He hesitated, then shook his head. No. One word. Heavy with everything he'd chosen not to say. She watched the snow melt off his boots. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the only ghost in the room. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would ask more. But tonight, the fire was enough. The snow softened into mud by the second week of March, leaving the world raw and dripping. Icicles wept from the eaves, and the wind, once cruel and cutting, grew shy, content to rattle loose shutters and sigh across the prairie. Spring had not arrived yet, not truly, but its promise hung in the air like the scent of lilac not yet bloomed. And in that thawing world, something else began to warm, the space between the Comanche and the widow. Tahu no longer slept by the fire. He had taken to the small corner near the hearth, where he fashioned a sleeping mat from spare quilts and pine boughs he gathered from the woods. His movements were careful, quiet, deliberate. He did not linger where he wasn't needed. And Ellen noticed, he never turned his back to the children, nor to her. He stayed open, visible, unthreatening, as though aware of how every inch of silence mattered in earning trust. He did not speak much, though his vocabulary was growing. He learned the names of the twins, Ruth and Josiah, and said them with a softness that surprised her. When he spoke Ellen's name, it was always slow, measured, as if it tasted of reverence. He called her Elin, the second syllable catching in his throat like a half-finished song. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. Some truths come bruised and slow, needing quiet to surface. The children had thawed faster than she expected. Ruth took to showing him her drawings, made with charcoal on scrap cloth. She explained each image solemnly, and though he didn't always understand the words, he nodded as if they mattered. Josiah still watched him warily, but that watchfulness had begun to soften. He no longer clung to her skirts or avoided the hearth when Tahu was near. Instead, one morning, Ellen woke to find Josiah sitting cross-legged on the floor, showing Tahu a pine whistle he'd carved. The boy didn't say much, just offered the object with shy fingers. Tahu examined it, blew into it once, producing a high, sweet note, and smiled. A quiet smile, barely there, but real. Josiah smiled back. That was the morning Ellen caught herself watching them and feeling something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even relief. It was the unsettling warmth of hope. And hope, she'd learned, was a dangerous thing to let grow unguarded. Later that day, she and Tahu worked side by side to mend the chicken coop roof. He climbed the ladder without asking. When she passed him nails, their hands brushed, and neither flinched. She watched him work, how his hands moved with reverence. He handled even broken wood like it deserved a second chance. "You've done this before," she said, breaking their usual quiet. He nodded once. "Build much? For your people?" He glanced down at her, then back at the sky. "For wife. Long ago." The wind tugged at her skirt then. She did not speak. She did not ask more. But she remembered the way his eyes changed, how they dimmed just slightly, like clouds slipping over a sun that had shone too briefly. That night, he lit the fire without being asked. She let him. They settled into something not quite routine but familiar. He fished near the creek, brought back trout he cleaned and offered wordlessly. She made soup. He split logs without prompting. She repaired his shirt, one stitch at a time, while he sat near the window carving a wooden bird for Ruth. There were no grand gestures. Just the small, quiet offerings people make when they want to stay. Once, in the hush between dusk and sleep, she found herself standing by the window, watching the fields beyond the house. The moon carved silver into the earth. She felt him approach before she heard him. "Why did you not leave?" she asked. "After the fever passed." He was quiet for a long time. "I would not leave children," he said at last. She turned then, surprised by the answer, by its simplicity. "You stayed for them?" He met her gaze. "They gave me name. Not savage, not ghost, just Tahu." She swallowed. The fire crackled behind them. His face, lit in that glow, was solemn but soft. "Where would you go?" she asked. "Nowhere," he said, and then, after a breath, "No one waits." So she nodded, said no more. In the days that followed, the bond deepened not through confessions, but through gestures. He helped Josiah learn to knot fishing line. He wove a simple bracelet of dried grass for Ruth, who wore it proudly on her wrist. He carved another whistle, gave it to Ellen. She didn't know what to do with it, not at first. She kept it by the fire, but sometimes, when the children slept, she lifted it to her lips and played the softest note into the night. He watched her when she didn't notice. She watched him when he spoke to the children. They orbited each other in growing warmth. Then came Ellis again. He arrived unannounced, riding his horse straight up to the porch as if it were his own. Ellen opened the door before he could knock. "Afternoon," he said, looking past her into the cabin. "Thought I'd check in again. Strange tracks near the river. Saw smoke from your chimney all week." "We've been burning wood," she said flatly. "Cold lingers." His gaze slid past her shoulder again. "That nephew of yours still around?" She didn't blink. "He's helping with chores. Needed a place to heal. Lot of folks wouldn't be so charitable." "I'm not most folks." His face changed then, pinched around the mouth, like he was trying to decide how far to push. "You sure you're safe out here, Ellen? Man like that, he's not one of us." She stepped out onto the porch, didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for the rifle she kept behind the door. "He's done more for my children than most men ever tried, including the ones who claimed to love me." Ellis stiffened. "People talk. Let them. You're putting them kids at risk." She stepped closer. "You're not here to help me, Ellis. You're here because you can't stand the idea of a woman doing fine without your hand at her back." He opened his mouth, but she shut the door before he could answer. Inside, Tahu sat still, hadn't moved. He had heard. He always heard. That night, he went to the barn and didn't come back until after midnight. She found him sitting on a hay bale, sharpening a knife slowly, eyes far away. "You're not the danger here," she said quietly. He did not look at her. "But I bring it." She stepped closer. "If danger comes, I'll face it with my eyes open. I'd rather that than live in fear of shadows." He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that carried sorrow. "You'll leave soon," she said, not as a question. "When the ground dries." The ache that bloomed in her chest then was unexpected, and she hated it for being so tender. She turned away before he could see it. Days passed. Rain came. Then sun. The snow melted in earnest. The creek ran high. Trees budded. He planted onions beside her, knelt in the dirt with sleeves rolled and sweat on his brow. She taught him the names of herbs. He taught her a word in his tongue, nama, which he said meant enough or full. She tried it out one morning, and he laughed. Not loud, but real. It was a good laugh. She wanted to keep it. Then, one night, as twilight settled soft as breath across the plains, the children already asleep, They sat together on the porch. She offered him coffee, and he took it, though he rarely drank it. The silence between them was different now. Not empty. Not strained. "I dreamed of my wife," he said. Ellen looked at him, but said nothing. "She died with our son. Long time ago. Bad winter. No food. No help. I'm sorry." He nodded. "She had your eyes." That stole her breath for a moment. Not because of the words, but the way he said them, as if he had meant to say something else entirely, but that was the shape it came in. "I had a husband," she said after a pause. "He didn't die in war. Just slipped under the wagon drunk and never got up. I don't miss him. But I mourn what I thought he could have been." Tahu stared out at the stars. Grief is strange. Sometimes it sounds like a bird, small, always nearby. She turned her face toward the sky. A single hawk circled above the ridge, dark against dusk. "Will you stay?" she asked, surprising herself with the nakedness of it. He didn't answer right away. But then he said, "For now." And she understood that was the most he could give, and it was honest, and it was enough. She smiled. The night held its breath around them. Inside, the children stirred in their sleep. The air smelled of earth and sap. And somewhere far off, coyotes howled not in hunger, but in song. The sun returned with a sharpness, as though the land itself was stretching out of a long-held ache. It dried the last of the snow, turned the mud to clay, and coaxed the crocuses into bloom along the edge of the cabin's path. The days had grown longer, but in Ellen's chest, time felt like it had started to fold in on itself. Quiet moments lingering longer than they should, good mornings meaning more than they ever had. Tahu built a new fence line that week. The old one had bowed under winter's weight, and without being asked, he took it upon himself to right what had fallen. Josiah helped, carrying nails and a battered tin, while Ruth picked up stray scraps of wood for kindling. Ellen watched them from the porch, one hand resting lightly against her hip, the other shading her eyes. The man who had once lain dying beneath her barn now stood upright beneath a bright sky, hammer in hand, sleeves rolled to the elbows, quiet strength in every movement. He looked like he belonged. Like this land, with all its rough edges and slow forgiveness, had claimed him. But peace on the prairie never lasted long. It began with dust on the horizon. A fine, rising line, too sharp to be wind, too steady to be storm. By midday, the shape of riders had emerged, 3 of them, cutting across the ridge to the south. Ellen stood stock still on the porch, squinting hard. Tahu had already seen them. He straightened slowly, passing the hammer back to Josiah without a word. The boy, sensing something shift, looked to his mother, then to the man beside her. Tahu said only one word. "Inside." Ellen didn't argue. She ushered the children into the cabin, then turned to him. "Friends of yours." He shook his head. "Soldiers. Or hunters. Maybe worse. They're coming fast." He nodded once. "I'll talk. Like hell you will. I won't fight. Not here. Not with them watching." She knew what he meant. The children. Their eyes. The memories they'd carry if things went wrong. The riders arrived in a spray of dust and sweat. Their horses were lean, travel-hardened. The men atop them wore expressions just as worn. One was older, a wiry man with a rifle slung over his back. The second was broader, sunburnt, with a scar running from his ear to his jaw. The third was young, too young, with a face still learning how to harden but already trying. They dismounted without ceremony. "You the widow Dane?" the older one called out. Ellen stepped forward. "I am. We're tracking a man. Injured. Comanche. Fled south after a skirmish outside Copper Ridge. Lost a few good men." Her heart tightened. "We think he came through here. Your neighbor Ellis said you had a stranger under your roof. Said he saw him out back. Of course he did." She folded her arms. "I took in no raider. Only a traveler. Sick from the storm. Never said a word about battles. You'll understand if we take a look around. Tahu stepped into view then. Not armed. Not hiding. He moved with that same quiet grace, feet steady, eyes level. "I am who you seek," he said, voice calm, rough with disuse. The men reached for their weapons. Ellen stepped between them. "He's not what you think." The broad man laughed. "Lady, we know what he is. You don't hide men like him unless you're confused or compromised. He hasn't harmed a soul. He's helped my children, saved my chickens, built that fence you're leaning on." The older man didn't blink. He was seen with a bow. "That's enough for us." Tahu raised his hand slowly, in a gesture that somehow conveyed strength, not surrender. "I ran," he said. "No fight. No blood on my hands. Men died," the young one muttered, hand still on his gun. "Maybe they were chasing someone who didn't want to die," Ellen said sharply. "Did you think of that?" The older man frowned, studying her like she was something wild and dangerous. "You've got children here. You want to risk them over a stranger." Tahu's voice was steady. "I will go. Not bring war to this place." Ellen turned to him, fury climbing her spine. "You'll do no such thing. You didn't run here to die." "I ran to live," he answered. "But I won't be the reason they burn this." The men shifted. The broad one spat in the dirt. "Turn him over, and we're done. Or we come back with more." She looked at the men, at their weapons, at the dust still clinging to their boots like blood. Then at the children inside, watching from the window. Then at Tahu, who had risked everything to be kind. She said, "Then you better come back with more." The older man studied her for a long time, then looked to Tahu. "We'll be back by week's end. If he's here, we take him. No questions." They mounted up and rode off in silence. The dust hadn't even settled before Ellen turned to Tahu, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "You were going to give yourself up." He nodded once. "I've lived hunted. I know what ends come." "Well, you're not alone anymore," she snapped. "Not in this house." That night, after the children slept, she sat beside him near the fire. "You should go," she whispered, not because she wanted him to, but because the thought of him being taken was worse. "I should," he agreed. "But you won't." "No." The silence between them was heavy, full of words not spoken. She reached for his hand. It was warm, rough, steady. "If they come again, we'll stand together." He didn't smile. But he didn't let go. In the morning, he taught Josiah how to set a snare. Ruth followed him to the creek. Ellen watched him laugh when Josiah slipped into mud and Ruth shrieked at a frog. His face, so often guarded, was open. The past had found him, and it would return. But so had something else. He had found a place where his name was not a curse, where his silence was understood, where his hands built instead of broke. And that was a reason to fight. Later, as the sun fell and the hills turned to amber, Ellen stood on the porch and watched him repair the barn door. The wind carried the scent of pine and coming rain. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "Let them come." He looked over his shoulder, as if he'd heard, and nodded. The past was coming. But this time, she was not afraid. The dawn broke too quiet. No birdsong. No wind. Just a heaviness in the air, like the world itself was bracing. Ellen stood at the kitchen basin, hands still wet from washing, staring out at the empty stretch of land beyond the fence. The sky was gold and dusted with cloud, but there was no comfort in it. The kind of gold that comes before the burn. Tahu was already outside, checking the barn doors again, his movements taut and rehearsed. He'd oiled the hinges the night before. Rehung the tools. Cleared the back exit with care. He said nothing, but everything in him moved with the purpose of a man expecting something to end. Ellen had felt it too, even before the first hoofbeat cracked the morning stillness. She heard them coming before she saw them, more horses than before, 6 maybe 7. The rhythm of intent. Not a neighborly visit. not an inquiry. This was a storm on horseback, and it was riding straight toward them. She stepped outside, rifle in hand, not raised but not hidden. Tahu joined her at the edge of the porch, his shoulders drawn tight beneath the threadbare cotton shirt she'd mended only a week ago. The same shirt he'd worn the day he taught Ruth how to listen for trout under running water. The shirt Josiah had tried to patch himself, just to be like him. They stood side by side, unmoving. The riders came into view through the dust, Ellis at the front, smug and stiff-backed, followed by the three who had come before, and more now, armed men from nearby homesteads, their eyes already full of verdict. Ellis didn't dismount. He looked down at Ellen with a face he might have once used to appraise cattle. His voice carried like a hammer. "You had your warning. This is your last. You bring all these men to kill one?" Ellen asked, calm, but only just. "Or did you come for me too?" Ellis narrowed his eyes. "We came to protect what's left of decency in this valley. You're harboring a killer." "He's not a killer," she said. "But I might become one if you keep your hand on that rifle." One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle. Nervous. The others were harder, colder. Tahu remained silent, still beside her, the weight of every war he'd lived before resting across his shoulders like old chainmail. The older man with the scar, Madden, she remembered now, spoke up. "This don't have to go bad, ma'am. Just step aside." But she didn't. She stepped forward. "Not this time," she said. "You men didn't come for justice. You came to make an example of someone who didn't kneel when you called. You came because a woman stood up and didn't ask for your help." Madden frowned. "You're choosing him over your own?" She met his eyes without blinking. "He is my own." Behind her, inside the cabin, the children were quiet. She had told them to go into the root cellar when they heard the horses. Ruth had cried. Josiah had clenched his fists so tight his knuckles turned white. She'd held them both until their breath slowed, and kissed their heads like she might never again. A rider moved his hand to his rifle. The barn door burst open. Tahu stepped forward now, but not to attack. He threw something small into the dirt. His knife. The one he'd carved handles into with bear claw etchings. A peace offering. Or maybe a line in the sand. "I will not run," he said. "But I will not be taken." Ellis's face curled. "Tired of this." He raised his rifle. The gunshot cracked like the world splitting. But it wasn't Tahu who fired. It was Ellen. Her rifle smoked. Ellis's hat flew from his head as the bullet carved through the brim. He jerked back, startled, almost fell from his horse. "You shoot again," she said, voice low, "and the next one finds your heart." Another man raised his weapon. Tahu moved like wind. He tackled the rider from his horse, the two men crashing to the ground in a churn of dust and limbs. The man rolled, reaching for his sidearm, but Tahu was faster. He slammed the butt of the rifle across the man's temple. The man went limp. Gunfire erupted. Chaos bloomed. Ellen dropped behind the porch beam, loading fast, firing faster. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed to warn, to break lines, to defend. Tahu moved like something born for survival. Not rage. Not vengeance. Precision. He disarmed a second man, turned the rider's own pistol against him, held it steady until the man dropped his weapon in the dust. It didn't last long. Too many of the attackers were only brave with numbers. And numbers crumble quick when one goes down. One man screamed. He'd been winged by Ellen's bullet. Another turned and fled without a word. The boy, the youngest, dropped his gun and threw up his hands, backing away like he wanted to vanish. Madden pulled his horse around, cursing. "We'll be back," he yelled. "You're done here." Ellen stepped out from the porch, shoulders rising with every breath. She chambered another round, leveled it at him. "No," she said. "You are." The silence that followed was thick as molasses. They rode off in pieces, a broken storm, pride trailing behind them like torn flags. The air settled. The dust began to drift again. Tahu lowered his weapon. And just like that, It was done. Ellen stood still for a long while, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from release. She looked at Tahu, his lip bleeding, his shirt torn, but standing. Still here. The children burst out of the cellar. Josiah ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist so tight she could barely breathe. Ruth ran to Tahu, threw her arms around his middle, burying her face in his side. He froze for half a heartbeat, then laid a hand gently on her head. "I thought you'd go," Ruth said, muffled. "I told you," he replied, voice raw. "I stay." Later, they buried the fight. No bodies. Just the cracked earth, the bullet holes in the barn wall, the dented porch rail. Evidence of survival. Not victory. Just survival. That night, they built a new fire in the yard. The children sat on blankets, Tahu beside them, Ellen watching from the porch steps, a mug of chicory in her hands. She looked up at the sky, velvet dark, stars scattered like prayers, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the end of danger, but the beginning of belonging. Tahu joined her, sitting without a word. She offered him the mug. He took a sip, winced. "Too bitter," he said. She smiled. "Tastes like peace to me." They sat in silence a while longer, the kind that didn't press, didn't wound. After a time, he said, "I will build a better barn." "We'll build it together," she replied. He nodded. "Home," he said, the word unfamiliar in his mouth, but not misplaced. "Home," she echoed. Then, softly, "Stay." He looked at her. Not surprised. Not hesitant. "I was never leaving." In the days that followed, neighbors came quietly. No apologies. Just gifts left on the porch. Flour. Salt. A spool of thread. Someone even left a chicken. No one said anything, but the message was clear. You were right. We were wrong. We won't speak of it. Ellen accepted each offering with quiet grace. The barn was rebuilt with new wood and old hands. The children helped. Tahu carved their names into one of the beams. Ellen carved hers beside his. On a spring evening, with golden light stretching across the valley, they stood together in the doorway of their new life. And as the sun dipped low, setting fire to the horizon, Ellen turned to him, hand slipping into his. "You changed my life," she whispered. He shook his head. "You saved mine." They stood in silence as the land breathed with them. And something in the wind sounded like a lullaby. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the firelight and heard the hush between two souls learning to trust, then don't go quietly. Like, comment, and subscribe for more Wild West stories woven from grit and grace. And tell me, from where in this wide, wide world are you watching tonight? The wind came low and long across the Bitter Creek plains, curling around the rust-red platform boards of the train station like a cat returning to a familiar step. Dust shimmered in the heat-hushed light, catching against the white hem of her dress, the only thing untouched by prairie grime. Penelope Rose sat with her gloved hands folded neatly on her lap, spine straight, eyes fixed on the horizon as if willing the tracks to sing again. Her suitcase, stiff-backed and scuffed with travel, rested beside her like a chaperone too tired to offer comfort. She was still. Not the kind of stillness that came from rest, but the kind taught by boarding schools and lonely childhoods. A stillness that hides trembling beneath poise. There had been no reception, no music or town bells. No one waiting with flowers. Just the dry sigh of the land and the occasional thud of her heart, sounding louder in her chest than it ought to. She had imagined it differently. Letters had a way of weaving dreams. His letters especially. Elias Thorne, the Baron of Dustmere Ranch, with words smooth as warmed honey and promises too soft to disbelieve. She had held each one close during her journey west. Tucked them in her bodice. Slept with them pressed beneath her pillow like scripture. In ink, he had told her of the wide skies, the quiet evenings, the vast house that waited with a room for her, curtains already chosen, and a piano that missed being played. He'd written of loneliness, of longing, and of her, how her words soothed the ache he carried since his mother passed. Penelope had read and reread those lines until they shimmered like truths. The train had come late, but she hadn't minded. She'd stepped off alone, the only passenger disembarking, and for a moment, she believed the empty platform was simply part of a romantic plan. Then she saw him. He stood at the far end of the platform, tall and well-formed in a beige duster coat, with gold cufflinks glinting at his wrists. His hair was darker than she'd expected, swept back with careless precision. But it was the woman beside him that made the breath stick in her throat. She was lovely in that showy way city girls sometimes are, dripping silk, red lips, a laugh that sparkled loud and hollow. Her arm was looped through Elias's. They shared the closeness of something claimed, not offered. Elias's gaze moved to Penelope then, not with recognition, but with a brief surprise one might give an unexpected painting in a hotel hallway. His lips twitched, not into a smile, but into something that might have once been guilt, long faded. He nodded, once, cold, unfeeling, and then turned. No explanation, no apology, no reaching for her hand, or her heart. The woman laughed again, too bright against the gathering silence, and the two of them descended the steps, walked past her, and were swallowed by the dust-glowing road. Penelope did not stand. She sat as if the world were waiting for her reaction. Her breath trembled but did not break. She placed her hands softly over the front of her dress, over the ache forming there, and lowered her gaze to her gloved fingers, which had begun to loosen from one another. No one came to ask her name. No one offered a ride. Bitter Creek Station was not the sort of place that concerned itself with the business of others. An old station-master, half limp and half asleep, shuffled out with a broom and swept around her shoes, his eyes never meeting hers. She watched her bouquet wilt by degrees in the sun. White lilies and cream roses, tied with a pale ribbon, now frayed and forgotten beside her on the bench. They'd been fresh in her hands just that morning, bought in a station stall 2 towns back. Now they looked like pressed things, relics of a ceremony that never would be. She remained until the sun bent low and the sky painted itself in bruises. Her throat ached, dry as the land around her. Still, she didn't cry. Crying would have required certainty, and she hadn't yet found the language for what had happened. It was the sound of hooves that drew her gaze back to the road. A single rider, his silhouette cut sharp against the falling light. He didn't come in fast, didn't ride with the urgency of someone trying to save or scold. His pace was easy, unhurried. The horse was chestnut, the rider tall and sun-worn, broad in the shoulders and bowed at the hat's brim. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked down at her. His eyes were quiet, not soft, not yet, but wide with observation, the kind that sees before it asks. He didn't speak. She didn't either. The silence between them held something strange. Not expectation. Not pity. Something else. He dismounted slowly, tying the reins with care. Walked toward her like a man approaching a scared animal, not wanting to spook whatever trust might still flicker. He nodded toward the suitcase. She looked at it, then back at him. Still nothing said, but she stood. He lifted the case with one hand and motioned toward the horse. She hesitated, looked once down the road where Elias had vanished. Then, with no ceremony, she stepped off the platform and followed the stranger. He helped her up, not touching more than necessary. His hands were calloused and careful. They rode slow, saddle creaking beneath them, the wind pressing dry whispers between their shoulders. She closed her eyes once, just to feel the movement, to let the road carry her somewhere unnamed. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. Yet somehow, in the shared hush of their pace, something began to ease. Night began to descend, stars blinking uncertainly overhead like small mercies. They reached a modest inn, low-built and quiet under the velvet dusk. He handed the reins to a stable boy without a word, then walked her to the porch. Still, he hadn't asked her name. Still, she hadn't offered it. The innkeeper looked at them with curiosity sharpened by boredom. But no questions were asked. The man, her unexpected rescuer, placed the suitcase on the steps and touched his hat, turning to go. But before he descended, Penelope found her voice. Just enough to say, "I don't know where I'm meant to be." He paused, then looked back. A pause, long enough to notice that his eyes were the color of dust before rain. "You're not lost," he said, voice low, worn. "Just not yet arrived." And with that, he was gone. She stood in the doorway of the inn, hands still on the railing, body still trembling from the train, from the man who never claimed her, from the stranger who didn't need to. Inside, she found a room waiting. Small, clean, and quiet. She placed the bouquet in a glass of water that wasn't quite enough, laid down in her wedding dress, and closed her eyes, not to sleep, just to remember how to be alone. Outside, the prairie wind pressed against the windowpane. It didn't howl. It sighed, as if even the land knew her name, and promised she hadn't come all this way for nothing. The morning after her world cracked and reformed in silence, Penelope sat at the edge of her narrow bed and watched a curl of steam rise from a chipped porcelain teacup. The tea was weak, too bitter, but she held it anyway, as if warmth itself might offer comfort where words had failed. Outside the window, the sky stretched pale and wide, the way it always did in the west, like it had nothing to hide and nowhere to end. She had slept in pieces, like an old song caught between stanzas. Her dreams had been thin things, ghosts of dancing, imagined halls, a man in letters instead of flesh. She awoke not with heartbreak, but with the hollow weight of having trusted a dream too willingly. Downstairs, the innkeeper offered her a nod and a half-smile but asked no questions. People in Bitter Creek had an understanding about silence. It was as much a currency as gossip. Penelope took her tea and a heel of bread, then slipped out before noon's heat had fully risen. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay waiting. The town, if it could be called that, was little more than a handful of buildings stitched along a road that refused to call itself Main. A general store, a blacksmith's barn, the inn, a telegraph post, and beyond them, open land forever. People moved about slowly, shadows stretching behind them. None looked her way long enough to ask her story. Perhaps they already knew it. She walked past the dry well behind the chapel, trailing her fingers along the worn wood of the railing. She didn't cry, but her throat ached in that quiet, private way grief often begins, with a question it's too soon to ask. What now? Then she saw him again. He was down by the far pasture, near the edge of where the land broke into brush. The same man from the station, the one who hadn't asked, hadn't assumed, only offered space. He was mending a fence, long sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands moving slow but sure with the wire. A horse grazed nearby, its coat dappled with sun. Penelope didn't mean to stop, but something in her feet refused to keep going. She watched him work for a moment, the way his shoulders bent with each twist of the pliers, the steady economy in his movements. She wondered if he remembered her at all, or if picking up wayward women from stations was something he did as naturally as breathing. He looked up, not startled, just aware. She stepped closer, her boots crunching over dry grass, and offered the barest nod. He returned it, then bent back to his task. She waited. Stillness had always been her native tongue. "You live nearby?" she asked finally. He glanced toward a weathered house on the hill, distant but standing proud against the sky. "That way." His voice was the same as the night before, low, grounded, no sharp edges. She felt steadier just hearing it. "I don't think I thanked you," she said. He shrugged. "Didn't do much." "You did enough." He finished his section of fence, wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, and looked at her again. "You eat yet?" She hesitated. "Tea. Bread." He gestured toward the house. "Come on then." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a command either. The house was humble, porch leaning a little, paint worn away in places, but it stood like it belonged. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old iron pans. There were no trinkets, no unnecessary things. Just clean surfaces, shelves lined with jars, a table worn smooth by years of use. He moved through the space with the ease of someone who'd built most of it himself. "Jonas Callahan," he said as he ladled stew into a bowl and placed it in front of her. Penelope rose. He didn't ask where she came from or what had happened. She almost wished he would. But something about the silence felt kind, not careless. It gave her room to choose what to say and what to keep. She ate in small bites, watching him chop wood through the window afterward, each swing a clean, purposeful motion. Over the next few days, Penelope found herself wandering more. Always she ended up near that pasture, that house, the man who didn't speak much but always noticed when she was near. He never invited her in again, but he left small signs. A fresh apple on the porch rail, a canteen of cool water beneath the elm, a book of prairie poetry tucked in a tin left open beside the fence post. She began to write again in the late afternoons. Her journal cracked open like a door she wasn't sure she had permission to walk through. Her handwriting had grown tighter, more deliberate. She found herself recording simple things: the curl of a crow's wing against sky, the feel of sun on her neck, the way her hands no longer trembled when she thought of Elias Thorne. Jonas showed up at the inn once, a sack of cornmeal in one hand and a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. "You still waiting on someone?" he asked, not unkindly. She shook her head. "No. I think I'm just trying to figure out what to do when there's no one to wait for." He nodded like he understood more than he let on. "There's work at the feed store," he said, "and the seamstress could use help. If you're staying, I don't know if I am. You can take your time knowing." Penelope didn't say it, but it struck her that no one had ever offered her time before. She'd been raised by decisions made for her: schools, propriety, letters from men who said pretty things but never asked what she wanted. One morning, Jonas brought her a small pot of rosemary. "For your windowsill," he said, placing it carefully. "Smells good. Keeps wasps out." She ran her fingers over the soft leaves. "You grow this little patch out back. Helps keep things rooted." She looked at him, really looked. There was something worn and weathered in his face, but not defeated. The lines beside his eyes weren't from frowning. They were from sun, from time. He had the look of someone who had known pain, but not let it sour him. A man who didn't try to be more than he was, which in its own way made him more than most. "I'd like to see it," she said quietly. He led her around the side of the house where the earth had been turned in long furrows. Herbs, mostly, lavender, thyme, sage, and a few wildflowers weaving their way through the edges. She bent and inhaled deeply, the scent grounding, earthy, alive. "It's beautiful," she murmured. He shrugged. "Not much. No. It's enough." That afternoon, she helped him weed. Her skirts tucked at her knees, fingers in the soil, the sun warm but not cruel on her back. They worked in easy rhythm, not speaking unless there was reason to. It was the most peace she had felt in weeks, maybe years. As the sun dipped low and the horizon turned honey-colored, she sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her palms. "I don't think I belong anywhere," she said without meaning to. Jonas didn't respond right away. Just pulled a sprig of mint, handed it to her. "You belong where you can breathe," he said at last. "Sometimes that ain't where you planned." She pressed the mint to her lips, tasting its green sharpness. Her eyes stung a little, but still she didn't cry. She had done enough of that, quietly, into pillows and behind smiles. This felt different. This felt like healing might start in soil and sunlight and a man who offered presents instead of promises. As the sky turned violet and the first stars blinked awake, she stood beside him at the fence line. Neither reached for the other, but they stood close enough for warmth to pass between. "You'll come back tomorrow?" he asked softly, not looking at her. "If you'll let me." He nodded once. "I'll be here." And that was all. He turned and walked toward the house, his figure folding into the dusk like it belonged to it. Penelope stood a little longer, watching the stars settle into their places, feeling, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she was no longer waiting to be chosen. She had begun to choose for herself. And that changed everything. Spring in Bitter Creek did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in slowly, brushing frost from the hills, unfurling green only where the sun lingered long enough. There were no sudden blooms, only the quiet insistence of life returning. And it was in that slow unfolding that Penelope found herself. She moved into a small room above the seamstress's shop, exchanging mending work for board. The room was sparse: a single bed, a cracked mirror, a basin, But the window opened onto the east, and in the mornings, sunlight would spill across her blanket like a promise. She began to sew again, not because she had to, but because the rhythm soothed her. Fabric between her fingers reminded her of control, of creation, of something she could shape with her own hands. Jonas came by sometimes, not often. He wasn't a man of visits. But she'd catch his figure in the distance when she walked, always tending something. Fences, animals, earth. He never asked what she was doing in town. He didn't need to. There was an understanding between them now, something unspoken but sure. One afternoon, he found her at the edge of the chapel garden, kneeling beside a broken planter box overrun with weeds. She was pulling them with delicate precision, each tug revealing a little more soil. "You trying to fix it?" he asked, standing a few feet back. "I suppose," she said, wiping dirt from her wrist with the edge of her sleeve. "Seems foolish to let it go when the sun's finally come back." He stepped forward slowly. "You want help?" She looked up at him, blinking once. "Yes. But not just with the weeds." That evening, they stood at the border of his land, looking out over a small stretch of patchy ground behind the barn. It was no more than a forgotten wedge of earth, hard and dry. But Penelope saw something else in it. Potential. A place to put her roots down without asking permission. "I want to make a garden," she told him. "Something mine." He studied the space. Then her. "It'll take work. More than you think." "I've got time." He nodded. "Then I've got tools." So they began. Each day, in the soft hours before supper, Penelope would arrive at the farm with her skirts tied up and her hair braided back, boots muddy, hands ungloved. Jonas would be there already, sleeves rolled, spade in hand. They worked shoulder to shoulder, not always speaking, but always moving in tandem, digging, turning, watering, clearing stones. It was labor, but not the kind that drained. It gave something back with each drop of sweat. Sometimes she would pause and catch him watching her. Not with hunger, not with pity, but with a kind of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she kept showing up. And sometimes, when she was bent over the rows planting basil or lavender, she would feel the air shift when he passed behind her, close enough to sense, never close enough to touch. They built a low fence to keep the rabbits out, and she painted it pale blue. He didn't comment, only nodded as if it suited things. They set stones for a path, laid mulch, whispered small things to the plants as they went, laughing at their own foolishness. But laughter came more often now. And then came the afternoon with the rain. She had stayed longer than usual, wanting to finish transplanting the mint. The clouds rolled in thick and low, and the wind picked up before she realized how dark it had become. Jonas came running from the barn, coat half-buttoned, hair slick from the first drops. "You trying to drown it all?" he called. Penelope smiled through the drizzle. "Mint loves rain. You don't." He offered his coat. She took it. They ran to the porch together, breathless, soaked, laughing like children who had outrun their parents and propriety both. For a moment, she forgot everything that had come before, the station, the betrayal, the ache, and simply stood beside a man who had given her nothing but truth. Inside, they dried their hands and sat on opposite ends of the old wooden table. The storm swept outside, rattling windows but not walls. Penelope watched the steam rise from the mugs he placed in front of them. Sweet tea with honey. Simple. Good. She asked about his family. He spoke of a brother, lost young to illness, a mother who sang hymns in the evenings, a father who died plowing too deep in the spring thaw. The stories came slow, halting, but he shared them freely, as if the telling was its own kind of planting. She told him of her aunt in Virginia, the cold house filled with rules and whispered judgments. How Elias had found her through an ad in a church bulletin. How his letters had seemed like light breaking through shutters. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "loneliness makes any voice sound like salvation." Jonas didn't speak, just looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, not to touch, but to set a small, hand-carved box before her. "Found it last week," he said. "Used to keep seeds in it." She opened it. Inside were 3 small envelopes, each labeled in faded ink, marigold, thyme, wild rose. "They're old," he added. "Might not grow." Penelope looked down at the box, then at him. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Then we'll give them a chance." And so the garden grew. Slowly, stubbornly. The wild rose never did bloom, but the time came up strong, and the marigolds burst gold like coins tossed into the dirt. Penelope spent more and more time there. Sometimes she would hum as she worked. Sometimes he would sit nearby, whittling or fixing tack, not needing to fill the space. One evening, as the light turned copper and the wind began to cool, she stood beside him at the garden's edge, watching the herbs sway in the breeze. "You did this," he said, nodding toward the bed of basil and sage. "We did," she corrected. He turned to her then, something deeper behind his gaze. "You're different now," he said. She nodded. "I feel like I've stepped into myself. Like I've been living just outside of who I was meant to be." Jonas looked at the garden again, then back at her. "I like who you are now." She didn't answer, just smiled and turned toward the path. But that night, in her room above the seamstress's shop, she placed the carved box on her windowsill and watched the stars gather like old friends. She ran her fingers over the lid once, then twice. And when sleep came, it was full and soft and without ache. The days continued, warmer now. Children came to see the garden, curious about the smells, the colors. Penelope taught them how to plant without damaging roots. Jonas built a small bench under the elm tree nearby. She began to read aloud in the evenings, old poems that once seemed distant, now close as breath. And without ever saying so, the space between them closed. Not with declarations or longing stares, but with presence, with shared labor, with the comfort of knowing someone would be where they said they'd be. The garden had started as a refuge, but it became something more. A mirror, a prayer, a slow confession between two people who had lost things and chosen not to lose themselves. One twilight, as the wind curled soft through the rosemary, Penelope turned to Jonas and asked, "Why haven't you ever asked me to stay?" He didn't look at her when he answered, "Because you already are." And for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt it. She was no longer passing through. She had arrived. The heat had begun to settle deep into the soil by the time summer rolled in, slow and relentless. Bitter Creek was wrapped in golden dust, its skies wide and humming with crickets and wind. The garden behind Jonas's barn had matured into something quietly miraculous. Lavender bloomed thick, honeybees danced from basil to mint, and Penelope's fingers, once tentative, now bore the gentle calluses of work done without complaint. It had become a ritual. Mornings for sewing at the seamstresses, afternoons in the dirt, evenings spent on the porch with Jonas, often in silence, sometimes with a book or a few words traded like heirlooms. She had stopped thinking about the train station, mostly. About the man who had once pulled her heart open with letters and then walked away from her like she was nothing but a lost appointment. Her days no longer orbited around his name. It was as though he belonged to another version of herself, one she had stepped away from in the act of planting time, of saying no, of staying when she could have run. But the past has a way of finding its feet, even in dust-blown towns where no one much notices anything beyond the next harvest. The carriage rolled into Bitter Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, the wheels cutting through the street like the town didn't belong to it. It was black, too fine, too polished, and when it stopped outside the general store, the silence it left in its wake seemed louder than its approach. Folks stared, but no one moved. Only Penelope, passing with a bundle of linens beneath her arm, felt the small, cold crack open inside her before the door even swung. He stepped down with the same careless elegance he'd worn the day he abandoned her. His hat was cleaner than the dust would permit, his boots polished, though the lines at his mouth had deepened and the sheen in his eyes dulled. Elias Thorne looked thinner now, wearier. But he still looked like he expected to be recognized. Penelope did not freeze, though her fingers tightened just once on the cloth in her arms. He hadn't seen her yet. She stepped sideways, slipping behind the barrels outside the shop, her breath caught somewhere between panic and clarity. He was speaking to the storekeeper, loud enough for everyone to hear, asking about land, mentioning Dustmere. He used phrases like unfortunate timing and temporary loss, as though financial ruin were no more than a stain on a cravat. Penelope listened, feeling the memory of his voice unspool in her belly like threads snapping from too much tension. She remembered every word he'd written. She wished she didn't. Later that evening, she found Jonas in the field, his shirt damp with sweat, arms glinting with sun and labor. She didn't speak right away. Just watched him work, the sure rhythm of his body in motion, the steadiness of a man who had never once left her wondering. He looked up, sensing her before seeing. "What's wrong?" She hesitated. Then, "He's back." Jonas stilled, shovel pausing mid-scoop. "The man from the station?" She nodded. Jonas's jaw worked, but he didn't speak. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the post. "Did he speak to you?" "No, not yet." "Do you want him to?" She looked down, then toward the garden. "I don't know." That night, Bitter Creek hummed with whispers. Elias had taken a room at the inn. There was talk of business, of rebuilding, reclaiming, redeeming. Some said he planned to buy back Dustmere. Others said he was looking to start again. Penelope said nothing. She stitched quietly, her hand steady, her mind not. He came to her 3 days later. She was kneeling in the garden, trimming the marigolds, when his shadow fell across the rosemary. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. The scent of cologne, sharp and foreign among the herbs, told her before his voice did. "Penelope." She stood slowly, brushing soil from her knees. Their eyes met like strangers. His were softer than she remembered, but not deeper. "May I speak with you?" he asked, tone tentative. "You're already doing it," she said, gently but without welcome. He faltered. She let him. "I made a mistake," he said after a moment. "That day. I thought I wanted something else. I didn't understand what I was giving up." "You gave nothing," she replied. "You simply walked away from something you never really held." He stepped closer. "I was afraid. That woman, Lucinda, she made me believe I needed to live bigger. But it didn't last. It never lasts." Penelope watched him, his words like rehearsed lines performed under the sun. He looked the same, but she did not. And she wondered if he noticed. "I came back for you," he said finally. "I want to make things right. Start over. We could still." "No," she said, soft but firm. He blinked. "You don't even know who I am now," she added. "I do. I remember you. You remember who I was. The girl who believed in letters. Who came running when you said the word, promise. But I'm not her anymore." He looked around, taking in the garden, the fence, the neat rows. "You live here. I am here." He took a breath. "You love him?" "The rancher." Penelope paused. She thought of Jonas's quiet hands, his careful gaze, the way he always gave her room to breathe. She thought of silence, and how it had never once felt lonely between them. "Yes." Elias turned his face slightly, just enough for her to see the faint wince beneath his charm. "I see." She nodded, not unkindly. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Elias. But it's not me." He didn't argue, didn't plead, just looked at her one last time, as if trying to fix her in his memory before she slipped away completely. Then he left, his boots scuffing the path he'd once refused to walk beside her. That night, Penelope found Jonas sitting on the porch, mending a bridle by lamplight. She sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her, close enough for the warmth to pass between them. "He came to the garden today," she said. Jonas didn't flinch, didn't ask what was said. "Offered me everything he thought I wanted. Again." He looked up at her, eyes steady. "And I said no." A quiet settled between them, soft as dusk. She turned toward him then, fully, and reached out, placing her hand over his. "I never told you what I wanted." He didn't move. "But it's here," she said, voice low. "It's the way you let me grow without question. The way you never tried to fix me." "I didn't need to," he murmured. "You weren't broken." She smiled. They sat that way for a while, hand over hand, nothing rushing, nothing more demanded. And when the wind stirred through the rosemary, and the stars lit themselves one by one, Penelope leaned her head against his shoulder, not with hesitation, but with arrival. In the distance, the sound of a carriage rose again, fading westward toward the edge of the world. She didn't watch it go. She had already let it go. The garden behind them rustled, alive with green. The mint would be ready for harvesting soon, and the lavender had started to lean under its own bloom. Tomorrow they would tend to it. Together. And tomorrow she would wake not to the ache of what might have been, but to the quiet certainty of what was. The morning of the wedding rose soft and slow, as if the world itself were holding its breath. A hush had settled over Bitter Creek, not the silence of absence, but the kind of stillness found in chapels just before music begins. The sky was painted in shades of brushed silver and pearl, with clouds drifting like lace across an endless ceiling. It had rained lightly in the night, just enough to deepen the green and stir the scent of rosemary from the garden, now trimmed and blooming like it had been waiting for this day. Penelope stood before the mirror in the seamstress's attic room, her hands working carefully through her hair. She had braided it back, then twisted the strands into a loose coil, leaving wisps free to dance along her neck and temple. There were no pearls, no veil, just a single sprig of lavender tucked behind her ear and a quiet breath in her chest. The dress was the same she'd arrived in, the cream one with the delicate lace sleeves, now dyed into a soft sage. It had been altered, reshaped by her own hands over the course of weeks. It fit differently now, not just in size, but in meaning. No longer a costume for a life she'd been promised. It was hers, through and through. She stepped out into the light, and the town was already waiting, not in rows or fanfare, but in pockets of warmth. The seamstress with tears caught in her lashes, the blacksmith with his best boots freshly polished, a boy from the feed store holding a bouquet of marigolds too big for his hands. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But they smiled. That was enough. Jonas stood beneath the elm tree near the edge of the garden, his hat in his hands, his boots freshly brushed but still caked in the memory of earth. He wore no suit, only his cleanest shirt and the same leather suspenders he always used, but there was a reverence in how he stood, as if the ground beneath him had been preparing for this moment just as long as he had. His eyes met hers the moment she stepped past the blue-painted gate, and though no words passed between them, Penelope felt it all, every silent kindness, every shared mourning, every inch of distance that had closed between them without ever needing to be measured. The preacher stood nearby with a small leather-bound book, its corners worn from time and sun. He cleared his throat, though the words he prepared seemed suddenly too many. He began to speak, slow and gentle, but soon paused when he realized most of what needed saying had already been lived. So he smiled and gestured. Penelope and Jonas stepped toward each other, and the garden watched with quiet joy. They stood close, closer than they ever had, and Jonas took her hands, his thumbs brushing across her knuckles like a vow in motion. "I didn't know," he said softly, "that home could be a person." She felt her breath catch, then settle. "And I didn't know," she whispered back, "that being chosen wasn't something you waited for, it's something you build." He nodded, eyes never leaving hers. "No promises," he said, voice steady. "Only choosing. Every day. As long as we breathe." "And even after," she replied. The preacher raised his hand gently, more for rhythm than formality. "By whatever grace watches over Bitter Creek, I say let them be joined. In whatever way the world understands." The moment broke like dawn. Applause was soft, unhurried. Some laughed, others wiped tears. The wind moved through the garden like a guest, stirring the mint, lifting the petals from the rosemary bush and scattering them at their feet like confetti spun from the land itself. Jonas didn't kiss her. Not at first. He only pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, and exhaled. And Penelope, eyes closed, felt something settle in her bones, a quiet click, like a key turning at last in the lock of her own life. When the kiss came, it was not for spectacle. It was not dipped or theatrical. It was slow and still, like water soaking into dry ground. And it changed nothing, but made everything more true. Afterward, there was no grand feast. No orchestra. Just bread, jam, and the company of those who'd watched it all unfold, Those who knew that love, real love, is not loud. It's in the gentle repair of things broken. It's in the patience of shared silence. It's in the dirt under the fingernails after a long day in the garden. Penelope and Jonas wandered through the herbs, hand in hand. Children followed at a distance, whispering and giggling, plucking petals from marigolds to throw in the air. Later, as the sky began to change, turning to gold and soft indigo, they sat on the porch together, watching the wind fold itself across the fields. The bench beneath them creaked, but held firm, like everything they'd built. Jonas leaned back, arms stretched along the rail. "You scared?" he asked, eyes on the horizon. She considered it, then shook her head. "Not of this." "Of what, then?" "Of waking up and not believing it's real." He reached down and pulled off his boots, set them by the step, then looked at her, soft but direct. "If it ever feels less real, come walk the garden. Smell the thyme. Run your hands through the lavender. That's us, rooted. That's how you'll know." She leaned into him, head against his shoulder, breath sinking with the quiet rhythm of his chest. A breeze picked up again, stronger this time, and somewhere beyond the far hills, thunder rumbled, a reminder that nothing, not even joy, comes without its storms. Penelope smiled into the wind. Let it come. Let it all come. She had found her place. Not in walls, not in vows, but in the slow, certain way a heart heals and reaches for another. The kind of love that does not announce itself with fire, but with hands held open. With time. With trust. And when the wind blew harder, tossing her braid and scattering the petals they hadn't picked up, she laughed. Not the polite sound she used to offer in drawing rooms or church pews, but a deep, ringing laugh, pulled straight from the belly of a woman who had lived, and lost, and lived again. Jonas laughed with her. The night came on full and sweet, with stars pricking through like distant lanterns. They stayed on the porch long after the last guest had gone. Talking. Not talking. Simply being. And in the hush of those hours, Penelope finally understood something she'd spent her whole life chasing. Love, the real kind, doesn't ask you to change who you are to be worthy of it. It finds you as you are, soft or stubborn, trembling or bold, and says, "Come sit beside me. There's room." The wind carried their laughter down the hill, over the fields, through the sleeping streets of Bitter Creek, where dreams ran quiet and strong like underground streams.